Hey there, and welcome to another LTD Woodworks video. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made my table saw sled with an integrated stop block, all inspired from a Jay Bates video and Brad with Fix This, Build That. Links to their channels and videos will be down in the description below. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and bell notification button so you don't miss any future videos on my woodworking journey. For now, let's get started. I started off by cutting the base to 36 by 24 inches and the fence pieces to 3.5 by 36 inches. Followed by plenty of Titebond glue for the fence pieces, I set to clamping them together. A little trick is to use a level. This will ensure that any bow in the plywood is removed during the glue up. Here I'm using a scrap piece of plywood to dial in the right thickness to fit inside the miter slot before moving off to the hardwood runner itself. And speaking of the hardwood runner, you want to make sure that the grain is oriented horizontally to the table saw surface. This ensures that any expansion will happen in up and down direction as opposed to side, which would bind up against the miter slot sides. The first cut is perpendicular to the grain to get the width of the runner, which slides just right, no side-to-side movement. Then after measuring the height of the miter slot, I set the fence and made the cut parallel to the grain. Here's a quick hello from my shop dog Cody. So after we robbed my son's piggy bank of all of his dimes, I set them in the miter slot to elevate the runners just above the table saw surface. Now my plan was to use CA glue, but the cap seriously glued itself shut. So I was stuck with using regular glue instead. No big deal. Just had to wait a bit longer. Using the fence of the saw, I set the base in place on top of the runners and then found something heavy to set on top till the glue dried. After the glue dried, I set to work pre-drilling, countersinking, and setting all the screws. Back to the fence pieces, I sent all the long edges through the jointer to give them a nice flat edge. Then I inserted my dado stack into the saw off camera and used the Kreg Mini Track as a guide to set the blade height, just so I could cut the perfect dado in the front fence. After marking out the final length, the bandsaw made quick work of cutting the Kreg Mini Track to length. Back to the base, I marked out 2 locations for the Kreg Mini Track and cut those dados about 5 inches off center of the future kerf cut. And with an old blade back in the table saw, I cut the Mini Track down to length to fit in the base. For the back fence, I chose to set my blade at a 45-degree angle and cut a small amount off. This is so that any sawdust that gets in between the fence and your work will not skew the cut. Now it's time to start assembly. I started off by using my 12-inch Incra T-rule to mark out my hole locations. Then setting the base onto the front fence upside down, I went to town again, clamping it down, pre-drilling, countersinking, and screwing in all the screws. To start working on the back fence, I will first start off by cutting a kerf line about 3/4 of the way down through the base. This way I can use this kerf line and an accurate carpenter square to to spend some time to get the back fence as perpendicular to that line as I can. I actually spent about 3 minutes going back and forth getting this as close as I could. To get ready to calibrate the back fence, I only set in 2 screws, one at each end. One will become the pivot point here in a bit. So the 5-cut method to calibrate a sled utilizes a large, square, scrap piece of wood, to which we will mark the first cut with a number 1. Make that cut, then rotate 90 degrees. Keep making cuts until your first cut gets back around to where you started. This cut, which was labeled number 1, now becomes number 5. Moving the piece of wood over about an inch, make that final cut. From that point, you can toss a large piece of wood and keep the smaller offcut. Now I'll measure the top of the smaller offcut, which in my case is 0.940. Then measure the bottom, which is 0.934. Subtracting the bottom from the top gives me 0.006. Now I take that number and divide it by the number of angles in the cut, which is 4, and I'm left with 0.0015. I'll take that number and divide it by the length of the offcut, which in my case is 15 inches, and that gives me 0.0001. Then multiply it by the distance from the pivot screw and where I'm going to make my adjustments, which for me is 32 inches. I'm left with 0.0032 out of alignment. So that's 32 ten-thousandths of an inch out of alignment. I think I'm pretty good with that, so I'm actually not going to be making any adjustments on mine. Now, if you did have a larger number and you did want to make some adjustments, what you would do is if you had a negative number, you would want to move the fence inward. If you had a positive number, you would want to adjust it outward. I'll bring you closer into the fence and show you how it's done. So now that we're up close, I'll show you what we're going to do here. Grab yourself a scrap piece of wood, preferably in a point that you can set up near the fence, and have a clamp ready to go. Now, if you had a negative number and you wanted to move it inward, what you would do is get your feeler gauge and grab the thickness that you need, and then go ahead and insert your feeler gauge, move the scrap piece of wood up against the feeler gauge, and then clamp this down tight. From that point, remove your feeler gauge, remove that screw that you had in there from before, slide the fence up against the piece of wood with another clamp, clamp that down, pre-drill a brand new hole and insert a screw. Then you're all set that way. Now the opposite is if you had a positive number and you needed to move it in this direction, go ahead and set the piece of wood tight up against the back of the fence here, clamp it down tight, go ahead and remove the screw so that now the fence is loose. Go ahead and insert the feeler gauge. This now pushes the fence outward. Go ahead and clamp that down tight again, pre-drill another brand new hole again, and insert a screw. From that point, you're all set. And again, since I'm sticking with what I got, I set forth pre-drilling and sinking in all the screws along the bottom of the back fence. Now it's time to finally install the Kreg Mini Track into the back fence. I use number 6 wood screws to do this. And for the track in the base, I also use number 6 wood screws, but I had to grind them down so they wouldn't protrude through the bottom. To give most of the sled a better feel, I use a small roundover bit and my Bosch trim router on almost all the edges. A quick sanding underneath and plenty of paste wax, and this sled is ready to slide like it's on ice. As I said, I'm using a stop block used by Brad and Jay. The small block you see here I cut off camera. Now I just need to make a spline to go into it. Getting cut down to just the right size, it slides nicely inside the track. Making several kerf cuts, I came up with the right size dado for the spline to fit in it, and a little glue and set it aside to dry. So I'll be using this knob kit from Woodpeckers I picked up in my local woodcraft store. Not a bad deal for only 10 bucks. Now using one of the bolts, I marked out where I need to chisel out some of the wood to make room for the bolt. Drilling a 1/4 inch hole off camera, I can now insert the bolt and the knob and get them into the sled. And for safety, I cut up some more plywood off camera, clamp it together, and then finally install it into the back of the sled. This will help to keep all my fingers in place while the saw blade comes out from back of the sled. Okay, so that's going to do it for this build for now. So a couple things. One, yes, I am going to cut down the bolt on the turn knob. It just doesn't need to be sticking out that far. I also need to make some hold downs for the center of the sled. And I also have an idea for a ruler on top of the front fence there for accurate measurements. Just make things a little bit easier. So as a reminder, make sure you hit that subscribe button and that bell notification button so you don't miss any future videos. Until next time, bye-bye.